The meeting is being recorded by the Economic Development Committee. If any other persons present are doing the same, you must notify the chairperson at this time. Seeing none, moving on. I do skip the MGL stuff because it isn't really relevant in a meeting like this, and I'll do a roll call. I'm Councillor Elmer and I am present. Councillor Bottomley is present. Councillor Gilmore said she would not be able to make it. Councillor Healy.
Here.
Great, thank you. And Councillor Mayo, I do not see him. I will update this if he arrives. The mayor's not here. Who do we have? That's it, I guess. Member of the press would be Franklin County Now. Okay. So approval of minutes. We have April 11th and June 23rd. Do we have a motion to accept them?
So moved.
I'll second it. Any changes? Any discussion?
Nope.
Okay, all in favor of accepting them as is, raise your hand or say aye.
Aye.
Thank you, Derek. So that's done. No public hearing, no motions. We had 2 items for discussion, but we have crossed out Aldi's. So John is taking over. He's running the status update on the cleanup of the Lunt property and PIP.
And I think I'll start by turning this over to Glenn Eyre. And we're going to see if, anyway, I'll turn it over to you, Glenn.
Where are we at, Glenn?
Thank you. Good evening. And I'm not sure if Lyons Witten, our LSP, will be joining us. If he does, then that'd be great.
Okay.
There were 2 things that I wanted either him or I can start to discuss tonight with you concerning Lunt. And the first is the response to the audit that was conducted a little over a year ago by DEP that resulted in the city being issued a notice of non-compliance. And the finding of the audit was that an insufficient site investigation had been performed. There were numerous deficiencies identified, and the DEP required that the city prepare a scope of work to address those deficiencies. As of today, more than a year later, that scope of work has still not been finalized. My opinion, it should have been done within a month or so, 6 weeks at the longest. But here we are a year later, and essentially nothing has happened on the ground. There is, I don't want to say no progress has been made, but there has been a number of pieces of paper shuffled back and forth. But nothing has really been done to address the deficiencies found from the audit. And I'm not here to point fingers or blame anyone, but that's just the reality of the situation. The conditions have not changed.
Can I ask you a question?
So, yes.
Has one of the requirements was some new testing? Has any of that testing happened?
Yes. So after the audit was done, the state issued a letter because nothing essentially had happened. The state DEP issued a timeline letter requiring that air monitoring be repeated in a number of residences, 9 residences. I think they got permission to sample in 7 of them, but this gets into the kind of the second point that I wanted to address, but I don't want to address it right now. And that is, we have this site designated as a public involvement plan site. And that does require by statute, by regulation, that the public involvement plan group be involved in any testing sampling that is done. However, my understanding is that air monitoring was done, and the PIP group was not invited to participate in that. So again, I think that is a continuing violation of the regulations, but that's not for me to decide. That's an enforcement issue for DEP. So there was some air monitoring done, which did find solvents in the air of some of the residences. We'd have to ask our LSP to discuss those results if he shows up. But that was reported to DEP. I think the process at this point is still waiting for that scope of work to be completed so that the site investigation can be, well, finished, but it really was started 10 years ago or so, and it hasn't been completed yet. To have that site investigation done so that we know the extent of the contamination, the delineation of the contaminant site, the contamination encompasses a certain area. We don't know a lot of that. We don't know the actual source of the contamination on site, what's contributing to the groundwater contamination, how much of the contamination is leaving the property, especially through the storm drain system and possibly traveling into other areas of Greenfield. There's so many unknowns. So as you probably know, the Lunt Group incorporated as the Lunt Neighborhood Action Group Incorporated, and we applied to DEP for a grant, a technical assistance grant. We did get funded $20,000 early this spring, and we hired Lyons Witten as our LSP. He is on vacation this week. He was going to try to call in from the Adirondacks, but it looks like he's not able to do that. So we have asked him to review and submit comments on the scope of work, which he just sent to us. And I will forward that, or John actually has a copy of it. He can forward that to the committee. But the comments that were made by our LSP reinforced the comments that the PIP group had submitted as comments on the scope of work and then the revised scope of work. And those comments really have to do with these technical issues of the site not being fully investigated, the delineation of the contamination not being known, and some other issues. And again, it's several pages long, and I don't necessarily want to get into those in detail, but it's an extensive amount of information that still needs to be developed just to understand the situation at Lunt, the extent of the contamination. Now, I don't want to monopolize this. If Susan has something to add to that and you want to call on her, I'd be happy to yield to her. But I would like to also discuss the PIP group process.
We'll come back to
at
you.
some point.
All right, Susan.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in the last 6 months, we have learned of several people in the area who are ill with illnesses that could be related to the contamination. We don't know if that's true or not, but or whether it's just the luck of the draw. We have no way to understand that right now because we don't know where the plume is, and we don't know what the offsite traveling of the contamination is. And so just to add to what Glenn is saying, not having that information means that there may be people who are ill, or there maybe the plume is fine and we don't have to worry about it. And we can say to people, luck of the draw. And as I'm one of them, I can say luck of the draw, and we can move on. But there are people in the neighborhood. I live one street away from the Lunt site. There are people on my street. There are people on several other streets who are concerned about this and are trying to figure out what to do. And there are folks who are very concerned. So I just wanted to put that into the mix because the delay in testing, the delay in dealing with this has meant a lot of uncertainty for folks. That's my, unless you want to ask me any questions, that's my comment.
Go ahead, John.
I don't know if you'll be able to answer this. My question's around the timeline, because I know there's a process with DEP. And they submit, there's a response, there's a submission. And I know that we've submitted a response. Did we get to see a response from OTO?
Is this to Glenn?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I was gonna ask the LSP, but
Yes, so eventually the DEP did issue an order that a scope of work needed to be submitted. And the developer's LSP did submit I don't know, I wouldn't call it a scope of work. It was about a half a page proposal that, personally, and also our LSP, we hadn't hired at that point, also looked at it and said it was just insulting. It was actually provocative that they were taunting DEP. And we responded to that and sent in a several-page long characterization of what was missing, which really was just reinforcing the points that DEP had made in the audit itself. And then a revised scope of work was prepared by OTO, and we did have an opportunity to submit comments on that revised scope of work, which again was several pages long. And that was submitted to DEP, but that was prior to us getting our technical assistance grant from DEP. So once we had that money, once we had a signed contract, which took several months to get through the process at DEP, then we hired Lyons Witten as our independent LSP for the PIP group. And Lyons has reviewed essentially all of the information up to this point, and especially focusing on the audit and the scope of work. And that was what I referred to as his comments on the scope of work, which we'll call the supplemental comments, which is a 4-page document, highly technical. I can just go over some of the key points. And one is that there's a large plume, a large amount of groundwater underneath the site that is contaminated with TCE, trichloroethylene, which is a chlorinated solvent that is heavier than water. So it was spilled on the ground or dumped, who knows how long ago. It started being in widespread use in the 1940s and 50s and continued probably up through into the 80s. While the business was in operation there, it was used as a degreaser, and there were several degreasing stations or units within the complex, including, I believe, one in the ball field area. Now, that solvent goes onto the surface of the ground if it gets spilled or it leaks, and it then settles, goes through the soil and goes through the water table. It's not like oil that would float on top of the water. It goes through the water table. It travels down. It's heavier than water. And it goes down until it hits a confining layer or bedrock. And then it can follow the slope of the bedrock. So that is one of the unknowns at this site. How extensive is that dense material? Where is it located? And how much is remaining that is contributing to the contamination of the groundwater? Because this solvent, TCE, and there are actually several other solvents that were also used at the site that have been tested and found in the contamination. How much of that remains, and how much is that continuously contributing to the contamination of the groundwater and also volatilizing into the buildings on the site? And flowing, groundwater kind of flows by gravity, and the groundwater is generally moving to the south and southwest of the site, under or through the materials under Kenwood Street and into the adjacent neighborhood. Now, I'm not making any of this up. This is what has been shown by monitoring wells that were drilled and sampled. And the contaminated groundwater is also leaking into the storm drain. It's not flowing over the surface of the ground and getting into the drop boxes or anything. It is actually flowing into the pipes underground because those pipes leak. They have joints, cracks, holes, discontinuous areas, and that storm drain system is collecting contaminated groundwater, and that groundwater is being discharged off of the property. It's running down past the ball fields, but the concentration of contamination, TCE contamination in the storm drain increases the further it gets away from the Lunt buildings that were redeveloped, which may be explained, but right now there's no explanation for why the concentration would be increasing the further it gets away from those buildings and the further it gets toward the ball fields. That's very unusual, or it's something that is of great concern, because there could be a source of solvents out in the ball field somewhere that is leaking, that is moving south toward Kenwood and leaking into the storm drain at that point, which would explain why the concentration of TCE solvent is higher in the ball fields than it is right at the parking lot in the Lunt facilities. So that's a major concern. Plus, that material is being carried off of site. That's an illegal discharge of a pollutant to the environment. And that's been going on for no one knows how long, but it's something that needs to be abated.
Glenn, I'm going to interrupt you. Susan has her hand up and Lion has showed up.
Great.
Okay, my comment is very quick, and it has to do with, Glenn has been talking about the question of the solvent going into the ground and hitting bedrock. My yard is 1 block away from the site. It is south and west of the site. The groundwater in my yard, if you go down 3 feet, you hit rushing water. So that whole question of whether we're hitting bedrock yet, we are not hitting bedrock in that area, just so you understand that the concern is that we know there is a lot of groundwater underneath that, that area. And as a matter of fact, in the ball field, there are some times where it never dries out. It just, you walk in those particular areas and it always seems to be at least a little bit wet. Even during the drought last summer, it seemed to be a little bit wet. So the groundwater there is very, very close to the surface.
Trick is to have Lion come in without repeating what
Right.
Lion has already said.
Okay, and I want to now move over to let Lions speak if that's the next order of business.
Let me just say, Lions, thank you for making it. And that Glenn has spoken for about, I don't know, 25 minutes. It'd be great if we could make it so you're not repeating what he said. I don't know how we do that. But you got a
I
question?
don't either, but I'll try to hit what I think are the highlights. How's that sound?
Sure.
That's good. I did talk about the storm drains and I talked about TCE contaminated groundwater.
So
So that's,
I think the basic problem so far is that the extent of contamination has not been determined. And there's an issue of solvents being discharged to the storm drain, and where do they go in? You know, we sort of know where they go in, it's right in front of the site, but then the question is, where do they go after that? And if they're getting in because it's a leaky storm drain, then they're probably getting out the same way in another location where groundwater is slightly below the drain instead of above the bottom of the drain.
Can I ask a procedural question? Glenn explained that we have something from the towns, the developers. You ask it. What comes next in terms of response to this, to the Mass DEP, and what do we expect next from the developer?
I have just finished a supplemental response. The PIP group has submitted several responses to the phase 2 to the DEP, full of a long list of really good comments, critique, questions. It's really very well done. I think Glenn and whoever else helped write that did a very nice job. My company has just finished a set of supplemental comments that we will get into DEP this week. And what should happen next is that Mass DEP should issue probably a notice of audit findings. They reviewed the phase 2 scope of work, issued a set of audit findings, and OTO responded with a revised phase 2 scope of work that was still inadequate. And so the PIP group's additional comments and the OHI supplemental comments will hopefully help DEP write another notice of audit findings, indicating what they want to see in the phase 2 scope of work, so that when OTO gets started, they're working on something that everyone agrees is what should be happening in terms of assessment at the site. That should be what happens next, is there'll be something from DEP issued back to OTO and the developer.
Quick question too, that we should know also the PIP group, right? Should be notified or somehow part of that process also?
They are automatically, by virtue of being a PIP group, they are automatically copied on all correspondence. That's one of the benefits of being a PIP group, is that every piece of correspondence is supposed to include you in the address bar.
But Glenn told us that OTO did some air sampling without alerting the PIP group. Is that a violation of procedure? Client?
That's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that. We knew they were going to do it. I'm not sure that they're required to notify the PIP group every time they go out and initiate an activity. They're definitely required to copy everyone on the results, and they're required to do so. I think it's within 7 days of receipt of the results.
And did you say everything you wanted to say about the PIP group? I know you put a pin in it.
No, Derek has a question though.
Okay, Derek.
Yeah, and this is going to be directed towards Lions. I was just wondering, Massachusetts DEP requirements, what the level of cleanup would have to be on site. Is it if they could keep the contaminants local on site, they don't have to mitigate any further as long as they alleviate further pollution to the community? Or is it something that they would be required to clean up until there is no more pollutant left? Is, I guess, my question, because I'm just trying to understand the bigger picture.
This site is no different than any other site in Massachusetts in that if they can figure out a way to do enough remediation to keep contaminants from going off-site, and they can somehow justify that there is a condition of, and these are in capital letters, no significant risk, then, which is defined by the cleanup regulations.
Mhm.
If they could get to a condition of no significant risk, then they can close the site. And it can allow contaminants to remain at a property. So
Okay.
yes, it's possible that they could do a certain amount of cleanup. If they have contaminants leaving the property greater than the cleanup regulations, and in this case, that would be S1 soil standards or GW2 groundwater standards. If there's any of that is leaving the Lunt property, they should be required to clean that up, because you couldn't have no significant risk if the groundwater levels are high enough that you could be getting vapors into people's homes, even if they're not detecting them in those homes.
Okay, and then just a follow up to that. So, as we know, Glenn keeps mentioning the catch basin. The permissible limits and I guess the groundwater monitoring there, how high above the limits was that? Was it drastic? Was it very close to permissible? I'm just trying to gather all the facts.
It's above the permissible level. In most areas, it's not hundreds of times over the limit, but it is over the limit.
So it is over the limit. And then
Yeah.
just one more follow up. So now let's say continued ground monitoring occurs as part of this phase 2, which I'm sure will be included.
Yes.
and maybe a more extensive could the DEP require them to go further off site with their ground monitoring wells into the neighboring properties to see what the levels are there? And if so, and we find that those levels are above permissible limits, would the developer at that point be responsible for cleanup of off-site properties?
DEP has already required that they do exactly what you suggest. The PIP group has suggested that more off-site monitoring be done, and my company has suggested that more off-site monitoring be done. A lot of the maps that show the extent of contamination at the site include data that was collected in 2013. They're showing, well, it's non-detect over here. Well, yeah, it was non-detect in 2013, but you haven't sampled it since then. So how can you tell us in 2022 or 2023 that that's the edge of contamination, and that's the extent of the problem? You really don't know, because you haven't done comprehensive sampling in many years, meaning beyond a certain number of small areas where they've been focusing. And so one of the things that DEP has told them to do is go back and do a comprehensive round of groundwater sampling all at once. I pointed out a number of locations where they show a non-detect, but the data is quite old. And I pointed out some very specific areas where current data needs to be collected to confirm that that's the edge of where the contaminant has come to rest. And one of the directions that has been inadequately assessed is depth, which is why Glenn keeps mentioning bedrock. And this is important at this site because the contaminant is a chlorinated solvent, and chlorinated solvents are heavier than water, and so they sink. And so Susan may have groundwater 3 feet below the grass at her house, as does everybody else, and the ball fields may be nice and soggy most of the year, and they may have contaminants at that shallow depth. But they could have far greater concentrations at a much deeper depth. And so the thing that LSPs should do at every site that has chlorinated solvents is put in deep wells and determine if the contaminants have come to rest at some sort of a confining layer at depth, whether it's a clay layer or the top surface of bedrock or something like that.
Excellent. That really helps. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Lyons, I have a question. You've recommended places where they test the water at depth. In your experience, will the DEP pick that up and require those tests be made?
I hope they do. They may choose to make their requirement in general language, as opposed to saying, thou shalt drill a deep well next to monitoring well MW 101. You need a 101 deep well. What they will most likely do is say, you need to provide comprehensive assessment of deep groundwater across the site. That's the language that is typically laid out by DEP, trying not to tell LSPs precisely what to do, but tell them what they want to happen and leave it up to the LSP to determine how that gets done. I don't know what they'll do in this case. They may just be fed up and say, we want 101D, we want 206D, we want 5MD, and lay out very specific places. I have no idea. I sort of doubt they're going to do that, because then OTO is locked into only having to go to those places. And if DEP is
I just have one question about, initially, one of our major concerns was TCE vapors and air sampling in the buildings that people are working in right now on site.
Yes.
And so one of the initial recommendations was to put an active management system instead of the current passive system. And so I know you were talking about no significant risk. And so I know when we had our one and only hearing, or whatever you want to call it, for the PIP, the community was really concerned that there wasn't enough air testing, and it was also a long time ago. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the active versus passive system and your recommendation.
I'm going to start with my recommendation, and that is that it should be made active. Should have been made active a long time ago. It's a very simple thing to do. The problem from their point of view is that once they turn it on, they can't turn it off until it's clean. And it's not going to be clean for a very long time. And they are then locked into most likely doing quarterly sampling of that unit, of the air in that unit. And they don't really want to be locked into doing quarterly sampling. But it would provide a whole lot more protection to the building. They're dancing around the issue of residential. The indoor air quality in that building does not meet the residential air standard, but it does meet the commercial/industrial air standard for a workplace. And they have a residential treatment facility where people come and stay long-term, people who have compromised health in one form or another, and they're being exposed to chlorinated solvents. The issue is that under the MCP, residential has a definition that includes that you live somewhere, and they're making the assumption that you live there for 30 years. And so OTO is hiding behind that, saying, well, it might be a residential treatment. That means that people come and stay there overnight. But it's not residential under the definition provided in the MCP, because they certainly don't live there for 30 years. And so,
am I correct?
so the commercial standard is okay.
Am I
I
correct
don't agree with that approach, but
the DEP let that slide? Am I right?
so far the DEP has let that slide. I have reiterated that I think it should be an active system in my most recent comments.
Have we done it? Have we done our job?
I think that's it for me for questions.
Glenn, did you say everything you wanted to say?
Yeah, I would like to just raise the issue of the public involvement plan, the group involvement, and it has been extremely limited over the last year and a half since we formed the PIP group. And we would like to see a lot more community involvement. And I understand that this is a complicated, unusual situation where the city is the owner of this property. And some people think that the developer is responsible, but if you read the lease agreement that the city signed with the developer, it stipulates right in the lease that the developer is not responsible for any contamination, and that it says right in the lease that DEP and the EPA, so the state and federal government, are responsible for all environmental cleanup. Now, that's written into the lease language, but I am sure that the state and the federal government did not agree to that lease arrangement when it was written. So what we have is a situation that is really, I don't know what to say, except that the DEP has issued a letter several years ago to the developers saying that they're not responsible for cleaning up the site. So when people keep saying that it's the developer's responsibility to deal with this, that's not true from several perspectives. It's not true from the lease agreement. It's not true from the letter that they got from DEP telling them that they were exempt from responsibility. And it really does come down to the city having to take a more active role in the cleanup of this site. And that's why the PIP group needs to be more involved. So I don't want to keep going on this, but the PIP group is in the process of submitting an application for some additional grant funding to the LSP Association. There's an association of licensed site professionals that they have a grant opportunity right now. And we're going to ask them for $7,500 to hire either an LSP or a professional facilitator to come into Greenfield and help motivate the PIP process to include the public in this cleanup effort. And so we would like to ask the EDC committee to support our effort to get grant funding to implement the PIP group in a really robust way. And we would like to send you a letter of support that you could sign, and we would be able to submit with our application for that funding that is specifically targeted toward increasing public involvement in the cleanup effort in Greenfield concerning Lunt. So that's my ask for you tonight. If you would do whatever you need to do to consider signing a letter of support for our grant application, which we would like to submit by the end of the month. So I understand that is short notice maybe, but you could perhaps vote to sign that letter of support for our effort. I don't have a copy of the grant application. There actually isn't a formal template or anything like that. It's more of a narrative that gets submitted to them, but I have basically outlined to you what we intend to ask them to do.
May I suggest you send us that letter and we will deal with it before your deadline. Tell us what the deadline is. But we can't sign anything. We can't vote on signing anything before we see it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I would appreciate that.
Thank you, everybody,
Really
for showing up. Thanks. That's the end of our agenda. I would like to introduce something as new business, if I could. Without objection. We had put on the agenda the proposed Aldi grocery store in Greenfield, and we've been asked to take that off for pretty good reasons. But where I've come in my thinking about this is that what we really need to address is how this major development went forward without a major development review. And I think Al is here to speak on that. Al, do you want to talk for a while?
Yeah, thank you, Phil. I have a little handout for you that is just meant to lay out some of the issues that I'd like you to take up, not tonight, but to be on your agenda, EDC agenda for the future. It has to do with the fact that 4 years ago, May 20th of 2019, the city council in its wisdom, thanks. You have one, Phil?
Yeah, I've got one. But I'll take another. I'll take it.
These are for the other members. Let me give one to Representative Slaughter. The city council in its wisdom made a decision to make a deal with one of the city councilors in order to gain a 9th vote for a library. The city council voted actually when the vote came down, it was a 12-1 vote to the word that the recorder used was to relax the environmental rules regarding major development review, which was an ordinance that was put in place around 1993, around the time the Stop and Shop was first built. There was a concern that the whole Route 2A would become very similar to what we see on the West Side Rotary, just very large scale national chain stores. So the major development review was designed to require developers to go through a much more informed and rigorous process of defending their proposal. And what happened with that vote on May 20th of 2019 is that this had been rejected a year or so before by the city council. It wasn't even allowed to be brought up. But the vote was taken to, for example, change a key threshold that had been governing major developments since 1993, so for about a couple decades, that said that if you generate more than, originally it was 500 car trips, average car trips per day. if you generate more than 500 average car trips per day, you need to go through a major development review. In 2016, the city council amended that to 1,000. And then in 2019, it was tripled to 3,000. Now, MEPA, the state Massachusetts Environmental Protection Act office, their regulations say that any project that generates more than 2,000 car trips per day has to go through a review by the MEPA Act, which is much more involved than simply what happens if somebody comes here to the town of Greenfield, city of Greenfield, for a site plan review, which if you've ever seen a site plan review, it's development light. It doesn't really answer many questions about the impacts of development. The major development review has requirements regarding fiscal impacts, environmental impacts, traffic impacts, impacts on neighbors and character of the community. So a lot of things that we should be asking developers to address. So to get to 3,000, it was done as the president of the council said at the time, Rudy Renault. It was a quote in the recorder. She said, "I can't tell you," this is from the minutes too, "I can't tell you that any evidence-based study was done to come up with that number." But that was the number that was promoted by the councilor who represented the 9th vote for a library, and that was the agreement that was made, and the city council voted for it. And by the way, voted for it before the library vote. So that the order of vote was that you show me that you're going to increase these so-called relax these thresholds by raising them so that fewer projects will qualify. Do that first, and then I will vote for the library. So that's what happened. And then it came to my mind last August 3rd when I sat through a very painful review of a process of a project that was proposed by a developer from Buffalo, New York, to take about close to 7 acres of land and turn it into a roughly 20,000 square foot grocery store, and quote unquote as of right. This is according to the city's planner, who told the planning board, this is an as of right proposal, you can't deny it. You can't reject it, which is just not true.
Just to clarify, the Aldi proposal, they said that they would generate a little over 2,000.
Correct. 2,160 car trips.
So it was below the 3,000 threshold.
Correct. Yes, it was above the MEPA threshold. So that's why MEPA did a review. I sat in on the call. They did a Zoom meeting. I submitted to MEPA a 22-page statement with photographs of the area to MEPA, which I'm pleased to tell you tonight, the developer will be required to answer all the points that I raised. That's a MEPA requirement. There were a number of comments submitted by residents. Mine was the longest comment, but the developer will have to respond to every comment submitted by the public.
Right. So the MEPA has, I've read what you forwarded from MEPA, and it looked to me like they put up several hoops that the developer has to jump through. None of them looked to me that they were fatal.
No, I would agree with that. They were.
Well, let me just say that what I've been instructed by the chairs is that, as I put it, this project is water under the conduit. What we're dealing with now is whether the council feels that the 3,000 is the right number, and whether we should reopen the major development review and look at that and see if it is what we want. And I've talked to Chuck Roberts at the planning board, and they're eager to do that. And so we may be scheduling a joint meeting of EDC and the planning board to look at just this.
Right.
And we kind of have the blessing of the chairs to go.
So thank you.
So that's where we are.
Yeah, good. Well, that's essentially the request, is to open it up again for discussion. Because 4 years have gone by, and fortunately, not a lot of major developments have come along that have challenged this whole issue. I just feel like citizens, one of the things, last thing I'll tell you, Philip, is that the major development review process requires a special permit. And what that means is that all the neighbors have the right to challenge a project, because the other night, first of all, I have not seen any neighbors. With this latest project that came through, no evidence of neighbors involved, yes or no. And by neighbors, I'm talking about the road, the Robbins Road area, or South Shelburne Road. All those people probably could have been considered.
Right, but we're
not going to litigate.
not going to really get that.
Reopening this discussion would be
So-
very helpful.
Yeah, and Derek and John, do you have any thoughts about this? Whether, I mean, there's an argument for making it easy for developers to develop because it brings jobs to the town and it's economic development. So I don't really know. I haven't tested the council to see if there's an appetite for making it tougher again.
Phil, let me add one thing that relates to that point. One of the things that bothered me when I was at the hearing is that I had spent a very long time presenting a 22-page document about what I thought were the flaws with the proposal. And one of the things I pointed out, and this was painful to watch, was that the planning board attempted to ask the traffic engineering end of the project about questions about level of service. What impact was this going to have? Why was this a level of service D with the project, but a level of service E without the project? This just didn't make any sense. The developer stumbled in trying to answer that, but it was clear to me that what was missing was what I had said earlier in the hearing. I had asked the acting chair of the meeting, have you considered, you have the right in your regulations, not in the zoning code, but in your regulations, which nobody ever reads, you have the right to retain a, quote, outside consultant on any technical matter. Could be hydrology, could be environmental impacts, could be a traffic engineer. You have the right to retain an outside expert, a consultant, at the expense of the applicant. The applicant can appeal the person you choose because they say he has a conflict or she has a conflict. But you have the absolute right as a citizen lay board that it does not have subject matter expertise, for example, in traffic. You have the right to educate yourself by having an outside consultant review the traffic studies that have been prepared by the developer and comment on them, et cetera. I was greeted with blank stares. I don't think anybody on the board even knew what I
Do
was
they have a
talking about.
budget for that?
Pardon?
Does the planning board have a budget?
No, it's paid for by the applicant.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
no, it's not an expense to the city. It's paid for by the applicant. And it's put there in many ordinances precisely because people understood that you've got an appointed board, which is somewhat of a political process. The mayor appoints people, the city council confirms them. But these are people who, by and large, sometimes we're fortunate enough to find somebody who has the subject matter expertise, but often they don't. And they try to come up to speed, but they're not traffic engineers.
We're still relitigating the planning board meeting, which.
No, I'm looking forward, because where I'm heading with this is that I would like to suggest something even more realistic and useful. I would like to tell, if I ran the zoo and a developer came to Greenfield saying, I want to build an X, Y, or Z, I would say, save me the studies that you will generate from your paid consultant. Save me from that. Don't submit those. Tell me what you want and describe it in great detail, but then let me hire the independent analysts who will produce the traffic study, produce the environmental impact study, do so on behalf of the city as its client to see if it meets the needs of the city, rather than we know it meets your needs. So that's even a purer request than saying, let's hire outside consultants. So it has nothing to do, I'm not picking on Aldi's or Benderson, because I've been watching this for 30 years, and I'm saying that we are outgunned. We are developer controlled and driven, and we need to regain some control about why are we placing things on the edge of town when our downtown is suffering so much from a lack of foot traffic.
This is totally appropriate for the MDR
Yes,
we discussed.
yes, I'm glad you agree.
Okay, so do you guys have any comment before we wrap this up?
I do.
Yeah, go ahead, Derek.
So for once, I actually agree with Al, which is surprising because I'm a
I
developer.
think this is twice,
Yeah,
actually.
Derek, come on.
You're-
We've agreed twice recently.
you would keep score. So I will say that I've built in a lot of different municipalities, and not once have I ever gotten through the planning board without a peer review process. So the peer review process does add time to the approval process. It could be, depending on how well the engineers do their job in the first place, you almost go in expecting it. So you go in, you have your peer review, they say, okay, well, we have some concerns with whether it's, conservation, or whether it's parking or traffic or stormwater analysis. We have concerns. These are our concerns. We're not the pros here. We'd like to hire a peer review group, at which point, the city would be required to go out for an RFP to multiple engineers, and they would have to select, the best fit for the job, which is usually comes down to the monetary value, right? At which point, the client or the developer would have to come up with a check. Typically, depending on the magnitude, it could be $7,500 to 15 grand. You bring your check to the city, they catch it, they get the peer review process going, right? And those engineers usually can set a deadline. We want, because part of their proposal is a timeline, right? How quickly they could turn it around. Typically, by the next meeting, you have comments from the peer review process. If you did a good job as a developer, which I like to think I do a good job when I develop properties, then you have nothing to worry about, right? But if you go in and you didn't do your homework, it holds the developers, it makes them accountable to their design. So, I think if you're looking for the best interest of the city, any project that comes into town that's going to have a major impact on traffic, it's a quick process. It's not like it will drag out 6 months unless you have major infractions or the white lies behind the development process.
Thanks, Derek. It's always helpful because Derek does this for a living. John, you have any thoughts?
So is this I'm somewhat ignorant on this.
Yeah.
A major development that applies to retail, industrial, or are they different? Is it any?
You can tell me, it's
It's any project. I think it could be commercial, industrial. It can also be residential. There are limits to how many units you can develop. Anything that is large scale, regardless of the type of use, is subject to an MDR. So we haven't had much of that. It's been mostly commercial, because we were dealing with big box stores. So it was mostly hitting that threshold, like some of the like the Walmart project on the French King was something like 12,000 cars a day. I mean, it was like way up there. But ones like this, they were below. They would have been above the 1,000, but below 3,000. And I think that it's a major project. When you think about how many car trips we're talking about, it gets into the 1,000, 2,000. Let me explain. 2,000 car trips is 1,000 cars because back and forth is counted as 2 trips, but it's 1 car. So 1,000 cars times 365 days is a lot of cars.
Ginny, did you have something you wanted to add?
While I was on planning, I can think of 2 that we had for major development review. The one property was one, and the hotel that where Governor Chevrolet is now. It's going to have a huge impact. and we did change the numbers.
Well, this has been very helpful for me. Should we wrap it up? I'll accept a motion for adjournment.
So moved. And let's,
Derek, Derek, have your hand up. You want to talk some more?
Oh, no, I just forgot to put it down.
Okay. All right, I'll second the motion. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Derek, thank you very much. So we're closing this at 7:32. This is a long meeting for this committee. All right, thanks a lot. Thank you for coming.
so,
Okay, thanks for running that. And I will hang this up now. How do I do this? End.
I have a lot to do.